Okay, so before you start today's homework, I think it would be really helpful if we go through and talk about the homework questions that you had last night. I think part of the reason why I wanted to give you questions with multiple choice was to get you comfortable with some of the answer options that are available. These are the same answer options for just about any Punnett square, a fraction that is over 4, or some sort of percentage that's either 25%, 50%, 75%, or 100%. And so I really wanted to just get you comfortable with this idea so that we could move on and start being able to do Punnett squares on our own, which is what you're going to be doing tonight. And so first, what you had to do was read the scenario and the background information, and then use the Punnett square, which has already been filled out for you conveniently, to answer some questions related to probability. And the probability could be related to the genotype and maybe even the phenotype of the offspring. So you had to pay attention. And while you were doing this, you had to explain briefly your answer. The reason I wanted you to explain was because of the fact that it was multiple choice. And as much as I know it's great to guess things correctly, it's better to know why something is right. And so we are simply just going to be going over this together right now. So for the first scenario, you have this condition known as Thompson disease that causes temporary muscle stiffness. And when a human first contracts a resting muscle, the muscle is slow to relax and may be contracted for a while, but after repeated use, the muscle can contract and relax normally. So this is a real condition that many people suffer from. And so in humans, some individuals have this disease and some do not. In this group, the gene for Thompson disease has 2 alleles. The allele for having the disease, capital M, is dominant, while the allele for not having it is lowercase m, it's recessive. And so this shows the cross between 2 humans. So as you can see here, this parent has Thompson's. Let's see, so they have this parent does not. Okay, so far we have one parent that has it and one parent that does not. But remember, this is a dominant trait. So as we fill in the Punnett square, you can see that, for example, this one went here, this one here. You can basically see as they filled in the Punnett square, you have 2 different options. You have the capital M, lowercase m, and you have a lowercase m, lowercase m. So those are the 2 options that came out of crossing 2 parents, one who had Thompson's disease, but was, and here we go with this person is heterozygous. Why are they heterozygous? Because they have a capital and a lowercase letter, whereas this parent is homozygous. But there are 2 options for homozygous. You could be homozygous recessive or you could be homozygous dominant. But this parent is recessive because of the fact that we had mentioned in the prompt that not having it is recessive. Okay, so based on this information, this is pretty much everything we need to know to kind of start looking at this Punnett square. So when we answer the question, what is the probability that a human produced by this cross will have Thompson disease? We are basically looking for the squares where we have a capital M. That's essentially what we're looking for. The squares that have the capital M, remember, dominant always dominates or overpowers recessive. So as long as we have at least one capital M in our combination, we're gonna have the Thompson disease. It's a dominant disease. And so all we have to do is count the squares. Square number 1, 2, 3, and 4. So of the 4 squares, 1 and 2 have the heterozygous genotype, meaning that they have the dominant and recessive alleles. So because of the fact that each of these has the dominant genotype or the dominant allele, that means that they are definitely going to have and show the Thompson disease. And so the reason why we use a fraction in this case is simply to show that 2 out of the 4 possibilities represents a child having Thompson disease. I'm going to fix that. There we go. So the answer for this one is 2 out of 4. 0 out of 4 would mean that none of the possibilities let's see, I'm going to move this. None of the possibilities are, or I guess you could say have, this capital M. That's not true though. This is also not true for B, that just one of them does. We can see it right here. One of them has the capital M lowercase m and the other has it as well. 3 out of 4, no, that's not true either. There's not 3 out of 4 that have a capital M. And 4 out of 4, no, we don't have every single square with a capital M. Now, maybe if this parent had 2 capital letters, the answers might look a little different. But remember, we're always answering based on what we're given. And in this case, we are given a parent that has a capital M and a lowercase m combined with the parent who has a lowercase m. And so that's why they end up having these 2 possibilities. So if you were to briefly explain your answer, you could say something about how you have 2 combinations. So for example, the Punnett square shows 2 combinations where the offspring is capital M, lowercase m. That could be one example. You could give a little bit more explanation if you want. You could give a little bit less and just say that 2 out of the 4 boxes have capital M. Capital M is dominant. You could talk about that too. There's no necessarily right answer. I just want to see what you were thinking when you were answered the question. Okay, so now we're going to move into a new question. So in a group of Dachshund dogs, some individuals have rough fur and some others have soft fur. In this group, the gene for fur texture has 2 alleles. The allele for soft is a lowercase f, so this is the recessive, as it mentions here, and the allele for rough, so this is dominant. If you notice in the question, they say the allele for soft fur is recessive to the allele for dominant or for rough fur. They're basically saying that this one right here, the soft fur, is the recessive one. Okay, so then we have a Punnett square once again. We have a parent, one of the dogs has the rough fur. They are homozygous, dominant, and one of them has the rough fur as well, but this time they're heterozygous, not homozygous dominant. And so we get these 4 combinations based on these 2 parents. And so the question is, what is the probability that a Dachshund dog produced by this cross will be heterozygous for fur texture? Okay, so we want to look for whichever options in the box represent heterozygous. If you remember, heterozygous is 1 capital letter and 1 lowercase letter, essentially. And so if you look at the box, we see these 2 out of the 4 are heterozygous. So 2 out of the 4 are heterozygous. Another way of thinking about 2 out of 4 is really just think about this box. So we have a Punnett square here. We have this Punnett square. In this Punnett square, whoops, here we go. In this Punnett square, we basically split it in half. Half of the square represents the heterozygous. Sorry, this coloring in is not going so well. Half of this represents heterozygous. The other half represents the homozygous dominant, right? So basically, you don't necessarily have to do the math for this where you would divide 2 by 4 times 100. You'll see that you would get 50% either way, but you could just look at this and say half, I know half is 50%. The answer for this is 50%. And something in your explanation should be explained using the square. So simply explaining what you see in the Punnett square is a great way to be able to explain and understand the answer to a question. Okay, so that one is instead of using a fraction, now we're using a percentage. The percentages are always the same though. So this one represents 0 out of 4, 25% represents 1 out of the 4, 50 represents 2 out of the 4, 75, 3 out of the 4, and 100 represents 4 out of the 4 boxes. Shows whatever it is that we're looking at. So never let the percentages or the fractions confuse you. They go back and forth sometimes, but it's the exact same thing every single time. These are our only options because we have 4 total possibilities of genotypes for our offspring. Okay, so now, next question. In a group of leopards, some individuals have a spotted coat and others have a black coat. So spotted and black. In this group, the gene for coat pattern has 2 alleles. A spotted coat is capital A, and that is dominant. And the black coat is recessive. This is a lowercase a, so this is the recessive trait. So we have 2 parents. One of them is homozygous dominant. Once again, why do we say that? Because of the fact they have 2 capital letter alleles. So they have the spotted coat. The other parent is homozygous recessive. Why? Because they have 2 lowercase alleles. And they are the ones who have the black coat. Or this parent has the black coat. So if you remember back to when we would have a cross where one parent had 2 capital letters and one parent had 2 lowercase letters, we would get the exact same option every single time. This option is 1 capital letter and 1 lowercase letter. This represents what we know to be hybrid or heterozygous. So, when we look at this question, what is the probability that a leopard produced by this cross will be homozygous recessive for the coat pattern? This isn't meant to trick you. There is no possibility, based on the square that we see here, of having homozygous recessive. We never see 2 lowercase letters as a possibility in this square. Because of that, the answer is simply 0%. There is 0% chance that we will get a homozygous recessive, because that would mean that the offspring possibility would be little a, which we don't see this in the square. So that never happens. So this is not possible. There's a 0% chance, 0 out of 4, we do not have this. And that's what you'd want to explain when you give your answer, is use the Punnett square. So really, if you ever want to explain, simply have the person who you're trying to explain it to look at your Punnett square and see what you see. Okay, so very last question. In a group of pea plants, some individuals have green pods and others have yellow pods. In this group, the gene for the pod color has 2 alleles. The allele for light colored pods, which is a lowercase d, and this is recessive to the allele for dark colored pods, which is a capital D. So this one's the dominant one. So we have a cross between 2 pea plants. This one is dark colored pods. And it's also heterozygous. And this one is also dark colored, but instead of being heterozygous, it's actually homozygous dominant. So hopefully at this point you're kind of getting familiar with the idea of something being homozygous dominant versus homozygous recessive versus heterozygous. It doesn't matter what letter we're using, it's all about, is it 2 capital letters, 2 lowercase letters, or 1 of each? That's how we recognize something being one of those 3 options. Okay, so then these are the possibilities that we get from the cross. We have 2 options, where we have a capital D, and we have 2 options where we have a lowercase d and a capital D. So we have 2 different options here. I color-coded them. What is the probability that a pea plant produced by this cross will have light colored pods? So remember that we said in the question that light colored pods are the recessive trait. Having light-colored pods would mean that you would have to have an offspring that has a lowercase d and a lowercase d. But do we have that here? Do we have a possibility where we have two lowercase d's? No, we don't. So the probability or the possibility of having a pea plant that has light-colored pods when they have two parents that have these combinations, again, is 0. Oh, once again, is 0. And you can see this by explaining using the Punnett square. We do not have this. So light-colored pods, this is recessive, and based on our two parents, there's no possibility where we would get one of the children, or one of the possibilities being light-colored in any way. All of these represent, so all possibilities represent dark-colored pods. One thing I do want to mention to you is that up until this point, all the questions were asking about the probabilities of certain genotypes mostly. So they were talking about homozygous recessive, we were talking about heterozygous right here. The question before that was talking about having the disease. So this one right here is an example of a question that talks about the probability of a certain phenotype. Not necessarily talking about the genotypes. You can see how we can use probabilities to talk about either the genotype or the phenotype. So this is simply the answers to this homework assignment, and hopefully this helped you kind of understand it if you were a little bit confused. But if you still have questions, let me know, email me, and we can talk about this a little bit more next week when we are together again. Okay.